Second Punic Wars. A war that would last around 17 years, seeing several changes in territory and numerous varied figures involving the likes of the notorious Scipio Africanus, Hannibal, Hasdrubal, and Hannibal Barca, and others. It would see two large empires of the Western Mediterranean in the form of Carthage and Rome come to odds. But what had started it? Who would be involved, and what were the motivations of the parties? In this audio podcast episode, we will explore this monumental and important chapter in world history and look at some of the sequelae that would come from it. The period prior to the wars, the embers of the First Punic Wars. It would be marked by the Roman Republic increasing its territory in southern Italy, and while this was occurring, southern Iberia would become more and more a Carthaginian region, as well as the Balearic Islands, Sardinia, and other locations. Two powers at peace with each other for the most part, in Carthage and in Rome, were increasing their control of the region, and several situations would call for their cooperation. But in 264 BC, something would occur that would change that, and the First Punic Wars would erupt. A conflict that would pit two regional superpowers and set them on course for a set of wars. The First Punic Wars would occur from 264 to 241 BC. And one party would emerge victorious at the end of them. The wars brought with them major territorial shifts. By the end of it, Rome would increase its power in the Western Mediterranean. Events during the wars would also set up Roman maritime success for the centuries that followed. The wars wouldn't be limited to one continent and would involve several individuals in a battle that would go down in history as one of the significant wars of the era. Prior to the First Punic Wars, the Roman Republic had been increasing their territory. Carthage would be another regional power, with great commercial strength. Previous years had seen the two powers at numerous times aid each other, including during the Pyrrhic War. Things would come to head in 289 BC when Mamertines took Messana. The Mamertines would seek aid which Carthage would eventually send, and a series of events would eventually lead to the start of hostilities between Carthage and Rome, including the arrival of troops within the region and the defection to the Roman side of Syracuse, as well as events that would see the involvement of a man called Hiero. 264 BC would see the starts of the war. Syracuse at a point in time would find itself under siege. About 2 years later, the Battle of Agrigentum would occur, leading to a Carthaginian defeat. 263 BC, sending of Roman consuls with forces to Sicily. At some point in the intervening time, Syracuse would be put to siege. Syracuse would surrender, and Syracuse would become an ally of Rome. Factors would force the Romans to forage for their food. During this, they are attacked by the Carthaginians. This chapter would see the involvement of Hannibal Gisco. The Carthaginian army, which Hanno would lead, would be made of numerous individuals with various origins, amongst whom were the Celts and the Iberians. Hanno is the son of Hannibal. Hanno, son of Hannibal, with the army marches to the rescue of Agrigentum, attacking months after his arrival in the region. Battle of Agrigentum in 262 BC occurs. A battle between the two powerful and influential states of Carthage and Rome. It would see individuals the likes of Lucius Postumius Megellus, Hanno, and Hannibal Gisco participate in it and play some varied roles. It would involve several interesting events. Included within it was a siege. It would also see the defeat of Carthaginian forces, some of whom would be able to escape. Possessions would be added to Rome, which it could put to good use. In addition to this, a new position was also added to it. The event had seen the involvement of forces under Roman consuls. Agrigentum's geography made it a position that was easier to defend. Included in this were rivers and slopes that were a part of its inherent topography. Possession of Messana by the Carthaginians would have an impact on the state of affairs at the time, giving them advantages that they could wield in order to gain the territory of Sicily and hamper the interests of one of its adversaries in the form of Syracuse. Syracuse's defect to Rome after the defeat of forces that belonged to Carthage and Syracuse, and the hiring of mercenaries by the Carthaginians, would be some of the numerous events that would follow. In addition to which would be the increasing importance with which Agrigentum would be seen by Carthage. Added to this was how it would become an important and central base for them, and would continue to be important in some of their affairs. Things would increasingly move towards a conflict between those in Agrigentum and the Romans. Large troops were coalescing around Agrigentum. More individuals would arrive within the walls of the city as they were relocated into it. Amongst the forces from Rome would be forces under the consuls Lucius Postumius Megellus and Quintus Mamilius Vitulus. The Romans would find themselves pounced upon at some point by Hannibal as they harvested crops. Rome lost several of its men in the events that followed. The events of the attack would give both sides information that would guide their future actions, and some changes and events would occur following it, as well as changes in the approach to events that had been unfolding. Several months later, Agrigentum would find itself with a reducing stock to feed its population, and given the developments that had arisen and the new situation they would find themselves in, they would be forced to send for assistance from Carthage. Aid, which would ultimately be sent in the form of forces. Hanno would occupy an important role in this relief force. Several positions would be of importance, including Heraclea Manoa, Tauros, and a supply base at Urbissos. Clashes between these forces and the Romans would occur, with the Romans at times losing men and troops and being cut off from critical supplies in a series of clashes. Several factors would be involved in the timing of the conflicts, and when each side would decide to clash with the other, at times conflict would be avoided. Eventually, a clash would occur between the powers, which would see fierce and protracted fighting and would see the Carthaginians emerge as the beaten parties. During this general period, Rome would also face conflicts with Corsica and Sardinia. 260 BC would see the building of ships by the Romans. It also would see Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio arriving in Lipari Island, his target being Lipara, and a counter by the Carthaginians who dispatched ships to the island under a man called Boodes. The Battle of Lipari Islands would occur. Battle of Lipari Islands. Prior to the events at the Battle of Lipari Islands, the conflicts between Rome and Carthage had been going on, and several battles had occurred before, including the notable Battle of Agrigentum, which had seen the involvement of individuals like Hanno, Hannibal, and forces under the consuls. In contest was Syracuse, and several clashes between the Romans and Carthaginians would arise. A naval battle would occur in the form of the Battle of Lipari Islands. Experience was on the side of Carthage, a nation more accustomed to naval warfare. In the past, when Rome had need for any naval assistance, they had leaned on their allies in the form of the Greeks and the Latins for some of that support. But now they had taken the opportunity to develop their own expertise and abilities, and therefore build their own ships, but they still faced limitations that they had, and near-instant results would not be a reality for the Romans. The Battle of Lipari Islands transpired in 260 BC and would conclude in victory for the Carthaginians, which up to that point in time had been the more dominant naval authority between the two powers, Carthage and Rome. It consequentially also resulted in not only defeat for the Romans but also saw the capture of Scipio, the Roman consul who had been tempted into moving towards Lipara, even though his fleet had several limitations. The event would see the involvement of individuals the likes of Hannibal Gisco, who had been involved in proceedings at Agrigentum and had been able to escape. Boodes and Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Asana were also be involved. As was stated before, the Carthaginians were the dominant naval authority up to this point, but before the events at Lipari, something had occurred that would set the pace for a coming change in the trend. The Romans would gain access to a Carthaginian ship and would study it in order to be able to make their own ships. A process that would fail to yield immediate results but would eventually pay off in the long term. Several factors would come into how a dominant naval authority remained dominant beyond the ship's quality. Included in the other aspects that had to be considered was the ability to handle those ships and the changes that had to be made in the way that one battled at sea. In addition to this, the makings of a ship could determine how one chose to fight, and several changes had occurred in naval warfare. After the events at Lipari and after others, the Romans would come to add the corvus to their ships. It would take time to train a crew in the ways of operating a ship. This would factor into why it was so easy for the Carthaginians, amongst whom was Boodes who had been sent by Hannibal Gisco, to overcome the Romans, and why events would unfold as they did with the outcomes that arose from the conflicts between the Carthaginian and Roman fleets. The Battle of Mylae would also occur during this time with Gaius Duilius at the helm. Some events would occur not necessarily in 259 BC. After the events in the Battle of Agrigentum, Rome would go on to Mytistratin, and then Thermae. Hamilcar launched attacks. At sea, Lucius Cornelis Scipio would be able to capture Illyria, but would face resistance when he tried to attack Olbia. 258 BC, Rome retakes Enna and captures Mytistratin, Hippina, and Camarina. During that time, the Romans won the Battle of Sosi, which would be between Roman and Carthaginian fleets. The general period would see a greater shift of the war from the theater of land battle to one that included the sea. 256 BC would see the departure of a Roman fleet from Ostia, and its crosshairs would be Carthage. The Carthaginians would, however, not be ignorant of the threat and would be able to respond to its growing size. The Battle of Cape Ecnomus would also occur. 256 BC would see a battle that would end in a Carthaginian loss and would involve personalities the likes of Marcus Attilius Regulus on the Roman side and Hanno and Hamilcar on the Carthaginian side. It would see the contribution of several ships, some of which would be sunk by the termination of the conflicts amidst fierce naval fighting that had occurred. It would also see extensive and large numbers of forces come head-to-head in a battle that would be noted down in history. The fleet on the Carthaginian side was trying to defend its homeland from the invading fleet of the Romans who had Carthage as their target. It followed several events like the Battle of Mylae, which had seen the victory of the Romans in an encounter with the Carthaginian fleet under individuals like Hannibal Gisco. A victory which had seen the participation of the Corvus, and one in which the Carthaginians had been made to retreat having lost numerous of their ships. It also followed events like the Battle of Agrigentum, which had occurred in the year 262 BC. An epic battle that would occur between forces from the two powerful and influential powers of Carthage and Rome. It had seen people the likes of Lucius Postumius Megellus, Hanno, and Hannibal Gisco. It had also involved several interesting events, and would see the defeat of Carthaginian forces, some of whom would be able to escape. Possessions would be added to Rome. Back to the Battle of Cape Ecnomus. With time, the conflicts would involve more people and more regions, and the theater where the war would occur would change with time. Several changes would also occur in naval warfare as well, including the introduction of the Corvus on the Roman side, a contraption which would have a massive effect on the course of naval battles between the two powers. Some naval events would occur preceding the Battle of Cape Ecnomus, including the battles of Sosi and the Battle of Mylae. Prior to the events that would occur at Cape Ecnomus, the fleet of the Carthaginians would pass through several points, amongst which were Heraclea Manoa. The Carthaginian fleet would be large and consist of several ships. Hanno and Hamilcar would play prominent roles within the Carthaginian fleet. The Roman side would see the involvement of the consuls Marcus Attilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Voso Longus, and would be made of a large number of ships as well, that would rival those that had been gathered by the Carthaginians. Both fleets transporting large numbers of forces and a large population who would play different roles, some of them ready for battle on land and some for battle at sea. Battle was brewing, and a battle that would see the defeat of the Carthaginian fleet in an event that would be remembered in history. Numerous events would occur after the events at the Battle of Cape Ecnomus. For one, the Romans would ultimately find themselves landing in Africa, their initial goal, where they could go on to attack Carthage. Secondly, the Carthaginians that had been spared in the fighting would retreat, recovering as they readied themselves for what would follow. Back to the battle. The Roman fleet would assume formation, and the Carthaginian fleet would do much the same. Hamilcar and Hanno would be present. The fighting and maneuvering would involve a feint on the part of the Carthaginians, which would draw some of the Roman ships in their direction. The Carthaginians would use this to their advantage. The fighting would go on and would occur via several fronts, with the forces having been split. In the fighting, numerous ships would be lost on either side as the fighting went on. At some point in time, the Carthaginian center would be forced into a retreat. Many ships on the Carthaginian side would be lost in the fighting that took place after. At the conclusion of it, the Carthaginians would lose a lot more than what the Romans had lost. Some of Carthage's ships would be sunk while others would be captured. The events here would be followed by other incidences like the landing in Aspis by the Roman army and the Roman siege on the city of Idis. A surprise attack by a Carthaginian force would also occur, It saw individuals like Hamilcar and Hasdrubal involved. Tunis would be captured by the Romans, and Carthage would seek peace, but Regulus would give harsh terms, so war would continue and would see several prominent events. Xanthippus would lead a force against the Romans and win at the Battle of Tunis. 255 BC, Battle of Tunis. Calamity and loss would strike the Romans as they lost ships and men in a storm. 254 BC, recapturing of Agrigentum by the Carthaginians, attack of Panermus by the Romans. Lades, Celis, Petra, Tyndaris would eventually be under Rome's influence. Loss of ships by the Romans in a storm again, 252 BC. Lilybaeum has a naval expedition sent towards it by the Romans. Selinus and Heraclea Manoa are captured. Thermae and Lipara are also captured. 250 BC, effort at capturing Panermus by the Carthaginians. The Romans are foraging for food when they are attacked. Commander Lucius Cecilius Metellus would play a significant role in the counterattack. The Carthaginian attack would involve elephants whose use would be limited by tactics the Romans used. The conflict at Parnomus would therefore go down as a Roman victory, 249 BC. Roman consuls for that year being Lucius Junius Pullus and Publius Claudius Pulcher, the father of Appius Claudius Pulcher. Lilybaeum is put to siege by the Romans, but the Carthaginians are able to supply and support the city. Surprise attack on the Carthaginian fleet is attempted but fails. Also in 249 BC, Roman defeat at Battle of Drepana. General period would see major sieges by the Romans on the Carthaginians. By the end, the financial state that both powers were in was pitiful, and the war had cost them many resources. Lilybaeum and Drepana were however still held by Carthage, and Rome would build a new fleet, launching an attack which would eventually prove successful against Carthage and result in the Battle of Aegiates Island. The fleet from the Romans had been funded by the wealthy individuals of Rome. 241 BC. Battle of Aegiates Island. The Treaty of Lutatius vowed follow, as well as the end of the war, with Carthage having conditions they had to meet which involved issues around territory and other things. The war would affect several regions, several individuals, and include several iconic conflicts. Both sides would endure massive losses, including losses in forces, ships, and resources, at the termination of which Rome would emerge the victorious party. Demands were made of Carthage under the Treaty of Lutatius, including territorial changes. Important Sicilian territory would be included in the territory that Carthage had to cede. We will end the episode here. In the next episode of this podcast, we will continue to look at the Second Punic Wars. Thank you for listening.